Well, we're joined by Dr. Robert Beckford, who's a theologian from Birmingham, and by David Whiteley, known to listeners of BBC One Extra as SideMan. David, you were at the protest in Birmingham yesterday. You spoke to the crowd. Just give us an idea of what it was like to be there and to be involved.
It was quite emotional, as like a proud Brummie, to see that many people gathered together, filling the streets of Birmingham as far as the eyes could see. People just, gathered in support of the one cause, the one movement, talking about Black lives mattering more, all over the world. And it's just beautiful to feel a part of the global community as well, to feel like we're doing our part where we are. It felt good.
And Dr. Beckford, what happened to George Floyd in America seems to have resonated here incredibly powerfully. Just give us some context. Why is that?
I think there are two reasons, really. One, because there is a Black Atlantic culture. There's a shared experience between African Americans and African Caribbean people in Britain, partly because of history. Migration from the Caribbean went both to Britain and North America. So I, for example, have relatives who live in America who are going through this kind of experience. So it's quite personal to me on that level as well. But also, more significantly, both in America and in the UK, there's a history of police violence against Black people. So consequently, people seeing what's happening in America can find points of correspondence with local incidents. And these incidents resonate with what we've seen in North America, and there are points of contact.
David, more protests are planned in the Midlands over the weekend. We're going to have protests in Leicester, in Nottingham, in Coventry, in Derby, in Wolverhampton as well. Do you sense anything different this time around? We've been here before. There have been protests before. Do you think this time it's different, David?
I don't think we've ever been where we are right now before. I feel something. It feels different. It feels like people are finally starting to wake up to the realization that racism to Black people is not an isolated incident. It's not happening in a corner. It's happening all over the world. Let's speak of things like Blackout Tuesday. Blackout Tuesday showed the whole world that this is happening everywhere, in every part of society. Every socio-economic class of Black person feels this. Celebrities are posting it that have money. People are posting it that don't have money. Everybody cares about it. So it's to see people, protesting everywhere just shows the level of emotion being felt in so many different places. I'm hearing that in all 50 states in America, there are protests happening. So it's just the feeling of togetherness that is so different from every other time that I think that makes this time so special and makes me believe and be optimistic for change.
Dr. Beckford, just to come back to what David was saying there about this reaching everywhere, what struck me last night in my home city of Hereford, which is quite a sleepy place, I can say that because I'm from there, it's very rural, it's not particularly diverse. Last night there were several hundred people kneeling in silence for 8 minutes 46 seconds, which for people who aren't aware is the length of time that George Floyd was pinned to the ground in America last night in Hereford. For me that is kind of mind-blowing. Does that resonate with you as well?
Oh, completely. I think it demonstrates two things. Firstly, the impact and success of anti-racism campaigns in Britain in particular. Hereford has a great football history. I'm sure you remember. It goes back a bit. What's important here is that there have been successful anti-racist campaigns in areas like football, and that's why I mentioned Hereford United. And so consequently, people are conscientised, they're completely aware of the fact that racism exists in every sector of British society. But there's more than just acknowledging it, and I think this is where the rubber hits the road, and I'm sure SideMan will agree with this. It's one thing to be emotional about it, to recognise that racism exists. It's a completely another thing to begin the hard process of dismantling racist structures and practices that lead to the kind of violence that we've witnessed. And that's the kind of work that we have to do now. Barack Obama has flagged this up. It's one thing to protest on the street. It's another thing to use that energy and that focus to do the hard work of anti-racist racism, dismantling systemic racism in the police, in other institutions in education, and making the necessary changes to have the progress that we need to see.
I just wanted to ask, Dr. Beckford, you kind of answered it, but SideMan, what happens now? I wanted to talk about your speech last night because there was a bit in there where you sort of addressed white people directly, whether that's the white people that were in the crowd or the white people that were listening. And the message, if I'm understanding it properly, seemed to be to keep talking. Don't be afraid to say the wrong thing. Is that an accurate representation of what you were saying?
Yeah, I was saying that you don't be afraid to speak, because there's too many times where we are letting things happen because we are trying to avoid an awkward conversation. People are dying and people are being maligned and marginalized because we are scared to have real conversations. It's time to start talking. And when you talk as a white person speaking on race to black people, there are going to be times when you say something that might offend somebody, but don't stop talking because of that. You cannot be corrected unless you expose what needs to be corrected. No wound can be healed that hasn't been revealed. And that's why I believe that you've got to keep talking so that we can reach solutions.
Dr. Beckford, I'm going to be honest with you. My journey, to use that awful word over the last few weeks, I'm quite early on in my understanding of these issues. I'll be perfectly frank with you. Sometimes you feel a little bit shut down by people who have said, look, it's not our job to educate you, go and educate yourselves. That's kind of the whole point. Other people are a little bit more willing to, let's have that conversation. What's your take on that?
Well, I think both strategies are important, and it depends upon the individual that you're engaging with. So look, I think it's really important that you, as somebody who's racialized as white, recognize that there's nothing wrong with saying things. I think there's something wrong with being silent. I think there's a complicity of silence. So I'm happy for people to talk and even get it wrong, because that's part of human nature. That's how we develop. We learn from the mistakes we make. But I think there's something else that we need to do, which we struggle with in Britain, especially with the educational system, both primary, secondary, and at university, which is to engage in radical truth-telling. What I mean by that is to tell the truth of British history and society, because that helps us understand how racism evolved and how we got ourselves into the predicament that we are in at this point in time. So without that kind of honesty, and historical honesty, will always misunderstand the present manifestations of that history. Cities like Liverpool have begun this process. Liverpool City Council announced a few months ago that every street, every road that has a slave history, they go into detail and acknowledge where the money came from to build particular buildings and institutions. It's part of the process of radical truth-telling. So I think we could do that in Birmingham. You know, we could look at Steelhouse Lane, which was where guns were made that were sent to Africa to kill Africans. We could look at some of the great patriarchs of the city and look at their involvement with colonialism and exploitation of African people. Might put a different spin on some of the great men of the city. And I think only by beginning that kind of educated process can we then make the connections between the past and the present.
Guys, it's been really interesting to talk to you. We have to leave it there. Thank you very much for your time today. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.